What's up, everybody? I wanted to expand a bit on my last video about America's worst presidents with some more insights into the Lincoln presidency and some controversial takes on what most people know as the Civil War, or as Murray Rothbard refers to it, and I've come to think of it, the War of Southern Independence. So let's start. Abraham Lincoln was born on February 12, 1809. He would become the 16th President of the United States in 1861. And the legacy of Abraham Lincoln in popular conscience is one of the great emancipator who saved the Union during the Civil War and abolished the evil of slavery in the United States. The following will be a detailed analysis of why almost all of that is historically inaccurate, revisionist propaganda. Upon looking into the facts of history, it appears obvious that the narrative was spun out of Lincoln's time as president, and that Lincoln's legacy is more in line with a tyrannical dictatorship than any great savior who should be revered. For starters, contrary to popular belief, Abraham Lincoln did not oppose slavery before or even during the war. In his first inaugural address on March 4, 1861, Lincoln made it clear that he had no ambition to change slavery as it currently existed in the United States, stating, quote, "I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so. I have no inclination to do so." Also in the same address, he promised to strengthen the Fugitive Slave Act, which was seen as a lawful duty for the federal government to return property to the property owner. In this instance, the slave to the lawful master. Lincoln strongly defended the right of slave owners to their property, going as far as to say that, quote, "When they remind us of their constitutional rights to own slaves, I acknowledge them, not grudgingly, but fully and fairly, and I would give them any legislation for the reclaiming of their fugitives," end quote. Weakening or even abolishing the Fugitive Slave Act would have been a bigger direct move to inevitably weaken or even end slavery than anything Lincoln would actually do during his time in office. Lincoln actually supported the Corwin Amendment in 1861, which passed Congress but failed to be ratified by the states. This amendment would have banned the federal government from abolishing slavery in any state where it currently existed. So imagine the original 13th Amendment being the exact opposite of the 13th Amendment we currently have. In 1862, a year after the Civil War had begun, Lincoln devised the Emancipation Proclamation, which was to take effect on January 1st, 1863, which was in the middle of the war. So the Emancipation Proclamation was not the cause of secession of the southern states, or even did it mark the start of the Civil War, because the war had already begun and been going on for over a year at the time of its conception. The Emancipation Proclamation also did not express desire to end slavery in the United States. Rather, it only applied to slaves in the southern states which had already seceded from the Union and in which Lincoln had no control. The Emancipation Proclamation did not, however, apply to the 4 states within the Union, where Lincoln did have the power to end slavery. There were over 450,000 slaves in these northern states, which Lincoln could have freed but did not. Those states were Maryland, Missouri, Delaware, Kentucky, and later a 5th was added with West Virginia. This had a profound impact at the time on how the world viewed Lincoln. On the effect of the proclamation, one newspaper wrote, "It has none. The freedom declared by this proclamation is a dormant, not an actual freedom." The London Spectator said of this proclamation, quote, "The principle of the proclamation is not that a human being cannot justly own another, but that he cannot own him unless he is loyal to the United States." Even Lincoln's own Secretary of State saw the Emancipation Proclamation for what it really was, saying, quote, "We show our sympathy with slavery by emancipating slaves that we cannot reach, and holding them in bondage where we cannot set them free." Lysander Spooner, the famous libertarian abolitionist, also vehemently opposed Lincoln's talk as just that, all talk. Prior to the war, Lincoln was asked his opinion on what should become of slaves if they were ever freed in the United States. His response on multiple occasions was to have them deported back to Africa, or even to Central America or Haiti. In fact, while sitting president, Lincoln held a meeting with freed black leaders and urged them to lead a colonization movement back to Africa. Lincoln repeated this notion again in December of 1862, where he said, quote, "I cannot make it better known than it already is. I support colonization." Lincoln had denounced abolitionists as zealots, who according to him would, quote, shiver into fragments the union of these states, tear to tatters its now venerated constitution, and even burn the last copy of the Bible, rather than slavery should continue a single hour. So no, it's a myth that Abraham Lincoln was some do-gooder who was just out to spread peace and equality amongst the nation, if only it were not for those vile, evil, rabid Southerners who found black men and women to be inferior. In fact, Lincoln himself used the words inferior and superior when speaking of black and whites. This sentiment was sadly popular throughout the country at the time. This was not exclusive to the southern region of the country. The only calls to end slavery were to end westward expansion of slavery, but again, this wasn't for moral reasons as much as it was for economic ones. The Republican Party's intentions to end the expansion of slavery are best summed up by Lincoln's confidant and U.S. Senator from Illinois, which was Lincoln's home state, saying, quote, "We, the Republican Party, are the white man's party. We are for free white men, and for making white labor acceptable and honorable, which it can never be when Negro slave labor is brought into competition with it." It's hard to compete in terms of market prices with slave labor, and the Republicans saw the expansion of slavery to hurt the white working class. This sentiment was expressed by several other elected officials at the time. However, direct economic implications were not the only concern. The political implications could not be ignored either. Lincoln and the Republicans also opposed westward expansion of slavery because of the 3/5 compromise, which meant 5 slaves would equate to 3 people for purposes of determining the number of congressional seats in each state. This would aid the Democrats in a national election. But if not slavery, what was the cause for the war? Well, here are some of the economic implications. Prior to the 16th Amendment of the Constitution, which was ratified in 1913, there was no income tax in the United States. Lincoln did attempt one during the Civil War, but it was struck down as being unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. The government made its money through collection of tariffs and excise taxes on certain goods. The tariffs which were imposed on imports had for some time disproportionately impacted the southern states, which relied heavily on agriculture for their economy. In fact, the southern states had been complaining of ever-increasing tariffs since the 1820s. A heavy tariff was created under the presidency of John Quincy Adams and enacted under President Andrew Jackson, which the South referred to as, quote, the Tariff of Abominations. This tariff harshly impacted the southern states. It placed a 38% tax on most imported goods and a 45% tax on certain raw material imports. These protectionist tariffs served as a sort of corporate welfare for northern ports, railroads, and harbors. In fact, 2 days before Lincoln's inauguration, the Morrill Tariff, Morrill, was adopted, which implemented yet another cost increase by virtually doubling the tariffs already in place. Lincoln spoke very softly of the issue of slavery, as I've shown here, stating that he had no intention of even attempting to make a change in the law. In fact, he seems to have bent over backwards to assure everyone of his intent to maintain the status quo regarding the issue. He did, however, express great disdain for secession and the loss of federal land and tariff revenue, stating again in his first inaugural address, quote, "In doing this, there needs to be no bloodshed or violence, and there shall be none unless it be forced upon the national authority. The power confided to me will be used to hold, occupy, and possess the property and places belonging to the government, and to collect the duties and imposts. But beyond what may be necessary for those objects, there will be no invasion, no use of force against or among the people anywhere." Here he was even using the words invasion and bloodshed only when discussing what would happen to those regions resisting the tariffs. Lincoln never once promised invasion over the issue of slavery, only over the issue of not paying these tariffs. At the time, the tariffs disproportionately impacted the Southern economy, which made up 70 to 90% of the federal government's income. Lincoln wasn't about to miss out on the heavy flow of money coming from the region. So let's get into when the war started. The Battle of Fort Sumter marks the beginning of the war. The fort was held in a port in the Charleston harbor of South Carolina, which was the first state to secede from the Union on December 20th, 1860. The fort still held Union soldiers and supplies, and the recently seceded state of South Carolina wanted this fort evacuated by Union presence. In a letter to the governor of South Carolina, Lincoln stated that he would resupply the fort peacefully or by force. Lincoln then dispatched 11 warships and reinforcements to the fort, knowing that if the newly seceded state did not react, it would make them look weak and their sovereignty would be a mockery. Lincoln needed a justification for the war he wanted because the notion of war was unpopular in the Northern Union. This act prompted the desired response from the South Carolinians. Lincoln would later write a letter to the Union general at Sumter, thanking him for getting the response Lincoln needed to invade the South. After the Union lost the skirmish at Fort Sumter, in which no one was killed, Lincoln then ordered all northern states to take up arms against the Confederacy. This action caused Virginia, who just 2 weeks earlier had voted to stay in the Union, to declare secession, along with North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas. Other states would later follow. The decision to secede was so tight in Virginia that the state split off into two parts, with West Virginia being adopted into the Union and becoming the fifth border state in the Union during the war to hold slaves. Aside from the direct causes of the war, there's a long list of atrocities and outright tyrannical acts carried out by Lincoln for the duration of the war. Maryland was a border state and a slave-owning state, which was torn between secession and remaining in the Union. Lincoln actually had legislatures arrested in Maryland to avoid a vote on secession. Once the Civil War began, Lincoln immediately suspended habeas corpus, which of course is the right to have your day in court if you're arrested. This resulted in the indefinite jailing of tens of thousands of Americans. And we're not talking about Southerners either. These are the numbers within the Union. This included journalists, reporters, and newspaper staff who merely expressed vocal opposition to Lincoln's policies or the war. Lincoln also forcefully shut down 300 opposition newspapers during the war. Lincoln had what was essentially a gulag in the New York harbor called Fort Lafayette, where these dissidents were caged. Lincoln wrote, quote, "The man who stands by and says nothing when the peril of his government is discussed cannot be misunderstood. If not hindered, he is sure to help the enemy. Much more if he talks ambiguously, talks for his country with buts, ifs, and ands." If that wasn't enough, after the Supreme Court ruled that it was unconstitutional for a president to suspend habeas corpus, Lincoln issued an arrest warrant for the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. The grandson of Sir Francis Scott Key was openly critical of Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus and was arrested as a result. He was sent to Fort Henry, ironically the same site where his grandfather was inspired to write the Star-Spangled Banner during the War of 1812. Lincoln nationalized railroads, censored all telegraph communications, used federal troops to interfere in elections, confiscated guns from border states, arrested the mayor of Baltimore, and deported an opposition leader in Congress to Canada for criticizing Lincoln's attempt to impose an income tax. Lincoln is also responsible for the massacres committed by some of his troops and generals, like William Sherman. Sherman was a bloodthirsty, openly genocidal butcher who committed several atrocities during the war, most notably his march to the sea. Upon arriving in Atlanta in December of 1864, he found the city largely empty, with the exception of women, children, and the elderly. Sherman ordered a bombardment of the city, stating, quote, "No consideration must be paid to the fact that they are occupied by families, but the place must be cannonaded." Sherman proceeded for days to rain artillery down on a mostly defenseless populace of the city. He would state that his intention here was to crush Confederate morale. Contrary to popular myth, secession did not cause the war. Lincoln did. Lincoln opposed secession and the loss of federal land and tariffs. In the mainstream conscience, we have this idea that the mere act of secession provoked this military response, but this is not the case. And it wasn't because the states seceded and wanted to maintain slavery either. Dozens of other major nations in the West that ended slavery did so without a war. Lincoln made it clear as day that his intention was to keep the Union intact and not to end slavery. Quote, "My paramount objection in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union." It cannot be understated how important this shift in American history was. It was a total shift in the sovereignty of the states, which up until this point had an understandable concept of their ability to leave if the federal government became too tyrannical for their liking. When the Constitution was adopted in the 1780s, Virginia, New York, and Rhode Island all agreed to ratify if they would be guaranteed the right to leave the Union if the federal government became too imposing on the states. They were accepted on these grounds. The important takeaway is that the Civil War destroyed possibly the most significant check on the power of a central government, the right to leave. At the expense of being mislabeled as a neo-Confederate, which I am certainly not, I think the wrong side won this war, and I claim the right to say so. The Confederate Constitution admirably mirrored the American one, with the exception of some additional rules on high tariffs, the banning of protectionism, and including a ban on the transcontinental slave trade. Economically speaking, it was a much better deal to the citizenry, with an obvious right to leave the Confederacy if the people desired. As for slavery, the evidence seems clear that in the public conscience and the incoming technological innovations on the horizon, slavery was on the way out. Virginia, considered a leading state in the Confederacy, prior to seceding from the Union, was just a single vote away from abolition in their state. Imagine an American history where the horrors of Reconstruction never occurred, where Jim Crow laws could have been avoided decades earlier, and racial equality under law could have possibly been a reality long before the 1960s. This reality was held back by a tyrannical leader whose ambition to maintain control over the regions who no longer wished to be subject to this control cost the lives of more than 620,000 Americans. It should go without saying, but I'm going to state it here. Slavery is absolutely abhorrent. And as a libertarian, I find it to be both a direct property rights violation and a clear violation of the non-aggression principle. Well, that's it, guys. There's so much that happened between 1860 and 1865, including the infamous assassination of Lincoln, but that should be enough to reasonably state the case that I've intended to make here. I might do more of these in the future because the information gathering has been very enlightening and eye-opening. Until next time, I'm out, but remember to question everything, especially when the narrative is centered around glorifying state power and control, which is clearly the case here.